Welcome to the deep dive.
Great to be here.
Today, we're embarking on a bit of an educational exploration. We're looking at the essential elements you need to create a valid trust in English law.
That's right, the three certainties.
Exactly. And this deep dive, it's specifically designed to help you, yes, you, the learner, really grasp these core principles, especially if you're, prepping for exams.
Yeah, absolutely essential stuff for trust law exams.
And we should mention the information we're discussing, it's based on materials made available by the University of London.
We're very grateful to them for making these resources available.
Absolutely. And just a reminder, this is purely for educational purposes. Okay.
Strictly educational.
So our goal today, we want to unpack the complexities of, well, certainty of intention
Certainty of subject matter.
and certainty of objects. We'll flag the key concepts, the important case names. We'll probably repeat them a bit to help you lock them in.
Repetition is key for memory, definitely. We'll also touch on administrative workability and capriciousness.
Right, those related ideas. Think of this as your focused study session.
We're here to guide you through it.
Okay, let's dive in then. Certainty of intention, the first one.
Yeah.
What's the absolute starting point here?
Well, okay. The very first substantive requirement for a valid express trust, it's that the settler, the person creating it, must have actually intended to create one.
Intended. So it's about their state of mind.
Yes, but critically, it's about the manifestation of that intention. It's not enough to just, think about it privately. Unexpressed intentions, they don't count.
Oh, okay.
The court made that really clear in Revandervel's trusts, number 2.
Yeah.
You need some proven manifestation, some outward sign.
Re Vandervel's trust is number 2. Got it. Any others?
And Burns v. Kendall also stressed that point. Intention needs to be, well, evident.
Right, so it can't just be a thought bubble. You need proof. Usually words, I guess,
Mhm.
spoken or written.
Absolutely. I mean, theoretically, maybe actions alone could imply it, but given how specific trusts are, it's nearly always found in words.
Makes sense.
And here's a really, really critical point for your studies. How we assess that intention is objective.
Objective. So not what the settler secretly meant.
Exactly. We're not mind readers. We ask, what would a reasonable person understand those words or actions to mean in that specific context?
Okay, so it's about the external impression.
Precisely. Interpreting the language, the circumstances. The big question is, did the settler intend to impose a legal obligation on the property holder?
A legal one, not just a wish or hope.
Exactly. A legally enforceable duty to use the property for someone else's benefit, not just a moral obligation like, I hope you'll do the right thing.
That distinction sounds crucial. Legal versus moral.
It really is.
Yeah.
The case of McCormick v. Grogan highlights this difference well. Legal duty versus sort of moral expectation.
McCormick v. Grogan. Okay. That difference, though, between legal must do and moral should do, that feels like a classic exam trap.
It definitely can be.
Can you give us a really clear example to sort of nail that down?
Sure. Let's think about a really well-known case, Rhee Adams and Kensington Vestry.
Rhee Adams. Oh.
Right. So in Rhee Adams, the testator left his estate to his wife, and he said he did it in full confidence that she will do what is right as for the disposal thereof between my children.
In full confidence. Sounds like he wants the kids to get it.
It sounds like it, yeah. But the court looked at those words in full confidence and said, nope, that doesn't create a legally binding trust.
Why not?
Because it expressed hope, maybe a moral expectation, but not a clear legal obligation. She wasn't legally bound. She could do what she wanted with the property.
Ah, I see. So the wording wasn't strong enough to create that legal duty.
Exactly. Contrast that with saying, I give this property to my wife to hold on trust for our children in equal shares.
Okay, yeah, that's much clearer. The on-trust bit makes it legally binding.
Totally different. It establishes that legal obligation.
So when someone just gives property away, a gratuitous transfer, you called it, how do we know if it's a gift or meant to be a transfer?
Good question. The courts look at the giver's intention again. Was it meant for the recipient to own it outright, a gift, or hold it for someone else as a trustee?
And again, it comes down to the words used.
The wording is usually absolutely key.
Yeah.
And remember, this is important. A failed attempt to make a gift, the courts generally won't rescue it by calling it a declaration of trust instead.
Right. Equity won't perfect an imperfect gift.
Precisely. The big cases there are Milroy v. Lord and Richards v. Delbridge. They really drive that point home. Milroy v. Lord, Richards v. Delbridge.
So just saying, I want you to have this isn't the same legally as I now hold this for you.
Exactly. That subtle difference is huge legally.
Wow. Yeah.
And another crucial thing to remember for your exams, you don't actually have to use the word trust to create one.
Really?
Yeah, the case Paul v. Constance is a perfect example.
Paul v. Constance. What happened there?
Well, Mr. Constance repeatedly said to his partner about money in a bank account, "The money is as much yours as it is mine."
Just that. No mention of trust.
Nope. But the court looked at those words, the context of their relationship, their actions, and said, yeah, that was enough. It showed an intention to create a trust.
So substance over form, in a way.
You could say that. It's the underlying intention demonstrated clearly that matters, not necessarily the magic words.
That's a really vital point. Okay, what if someone declares themselves the trustee? Same standard.
Yes, absolutely. A self-declaration of trust needs that same certainty of intention. Just, wanting to benefit someone isn't enough to suddenly make your own property trust property.
Right. Can't just wish it into existence.
Exactly. Think about Jones v. Locke.
Jones v. Locke, what was that one?
Father gives a check to his baby son, says, look, you here, I give this to baby for himself.
Sounds like a gift.
The court agreed. It was an imperfect gift, but crucially, it wasn't a valid self-declaration of trust. He hadn't clearly shown he intended to hold that specific check on trust for the son. His words pointed to a direct gift, just one he didn't complete properly.
Okay, so let's recap certainty of intention for exam purposes. You need a clear, objectively viewed expression.
It's that the property holder is under a legal obligation.
A legal one, not moral.
To hold it for someone else. Failed gifts don't count.
But you don't always need the word trust, like in Paul v. Constance.
Exactly. Key cases to remember. Lamb v. Eames, Richards v. Delbridge, Rees Shebsman, Milroy v. Lord, Jones v. Locke, Ree Adams and Kensington Vestry, and definitely Paul v. Constance.
Got it. Okay, let's shift gears. Second certainty. Certainty of subject matter. What needs to be certain here?
Right, subject matter. This means the trust property itself. It has to be clearly identified.
Why? What happens if it isn't?
Well, if you can't say for sure what property is meant to be in the trust, the trustees can't do their job, can they? They don't know what they're responsible for, so the trust fails.
Makes sense. Any key cases?
The classic examples are Ree Linden Wine Co. and Ree Gold Corp Exchange Ltd. They often come up together.
Ree Linden Wine, Ree Gold Corps. Wine and gold.
Exactly. In both cases, someone tried to create a trust over a certain quantity of goods, wine bottles, gold bullion, but these goods were just part of a larger identical stockpile.
Ah, so they hadn't separated out which specific bottles or bars were trust property.
Precisely. Because you couldn't identify the specific assets meant for the trust, the court said there was no certainty of subject matter. The trusts failed.
So if I have 100 identical gold coins and say, I hold 10 of these on trust for you, that's no good until I separate out which 10.
That's the general rule for tangible assets, yes. Until they're segregated or clearly earmarked, you don't know what is subject to the trust.
Okay, but I feel like there's a but coming.
There is. A very interesting and honestly quite controversial exception comes from intangible property, specifically shares. The case is Hunter v. Moss.
Hunter v. Moss. Right, this one rings a bell.
Yeah.
Definitely need to know this for exams.
Absolutely. In Hunter v. Moss, the defendant declared he held 5% of the shares in a specific company on trust for the claimant. Now, he owned 950 shares out of 1,000 in total, but he never said which specific 50 shares, 5% of 1,000, were the trust shares.
So, same problem as the wine and gold, surely. No segregation.
You'd think so, but surprisingly, the Court of Appeal said the trust was valid.
How? Why?
Their reasoning was that shares, being intangible, are all identical. One share in Company X is exactly the same as any other share in Company X, unlike wine bottles, which might differ slightly.
That feels a bit inconsistent with Ree London Wine, doesn't it? Tangible versus intangible seems like the only difference.
It does, and Hunter v. Moss has faced a lot of academic criticism because of that apparent inconsistency. People argue the analogy used in the case wasn't quite right, and there are practical problems too, like with capital gains tax. If the settler sells some shares later, which ones did they sell?
So the legal world isn't totally settled on Hunter v. Moss.
Definitely not. It's debated. One attempt to sort of explain it or rationalize it came later in Pearson v. Lehman Brothers' finance essay.
Pearson v. Lehman Brothers, what was the idea there?
It's sometimes called the proportionate share idea. It suggests that declaring a trust over, say, 50 shares out of 950 identical shares doesn't give ownership of 50 specific shares, but rather creates a kind of beneficial co-ownership in the whole block of 950 shares.
Ah, like the beneficiary owns a 950th share of the whole pot.
Exactly. So the claimant in Hunter v. Moss would have a beneficial interest proportionate to 50 shares within the larger holding of 950. But this approach is mostly applied to these intangible, identical assets. It's harder with physical things.
Okay, so that tangible-intangible distinction is really key for subject matter. What else causes problems here? Vague descriptions.
Yes, that's the other big issue. Conceptual uncertainty about the property itself.
Conceptual uncertainty.
Yeah, where the words used to describe the trust property are just too vague or subjective to pin down. The classic case is Palmer v. Simmons.
Palmer v. Simmons. What was the vague phrase there?
A testator tried to create a trust over the bulk of her estate.
The bulk. What does that even mean? Half. Most.
Exactly. The court said bulk is too subjective. It doesn't clearly define what property is meant to be in the trust. So the trust failed. Compare that to Re London wine, where we knew it was wine, just not which wine. Here, we don't even know what the bulk is.
Right. But surely some descriptions that seem a bit vague can work.
They can if there's an objective benchmark. Contrast Palmer with Rigolet's will trusts.
Rigolet's WT.
Okay, here, a trust was set up to provide a reasonable income to someone.
Reasonable income. That sounds pretty vague, too.
It does, but the court upheld it. They said reasonable income isn't purely subjective. You can look at the beneficiary's past standard of living, their needs. There's an objective basis the court can use to figure out what's reasonable.
Ah, so if there's a way to objectively measure it, even if it sounds vague, it might be certain enough.
That's the key idea from Rigolet. Is there an objective yardstick?
Okay. And what about the residue of an estate in a will?
Yeah.
You know, whatever's left over after debts and specific gifts, it's okay, even if the exact amount isn't known at the start.
Yes, the residuary estate is always considered certain subject matter. Even though you don't know the exact value until the end, it's a clearly defined concept. It's whatever is left after a specific process. It is ascertainable.
Good to know. One last thing on subject matter. Future property. Can I set up a trust today for lottery winnings I hope to get next week?
Nope, afraid not. A trust needs existing property. Something you just expect or hope to get in the future isn't legally yours yet.
So no trust of future property.
Correct. You might promise to create a trust when you get it, but that's a contract issue, not a present trust.
Okay, summary time for certainty of subject matter. Property must be clearly identifiable. Watch out for the tangible-intangible distinction, especially Hunter v. Moss and its criticisms.
Right, and conceptual uncertainty, vague descriptions like bulk can kill a trust unless there's an objective standard like reasonable income in Rigolet's.
And no trusts of future property. Key cases: Rigolet's WT, Hunter v. Moss, Re Goldcorp, Re London Wine, Palmer v. Simmons. Right. On to the third and final certainty. Certainty of objects. This is about the beneficiaries, right?
Exactly, the people who will benefit from the trust. A fundamental rule, especially for non-charitable trusts, is that they must have beneficiaries.
Why is that so important?
Because there needs to be someone who can, if necessary, go to court and enforce the trust against the trustees. Lord Evershed said it famously in Re Endicott. A non-charitable trust needs ascertained or ascertainable beneficiaries.
Re Endicott, what happened there?
Someone tried to set up a trust for the purpose of providing some useful memorial to myself.
A memorial, like a statue.
Maybe, but the point was, who benefits? There were no specific people who could enforce it. It was a trust for a purpose, not people, and it wasn't a charitable purpose, so it failed.
So generally, no trusts for abstract purposes, only for people.
For private non-charitable trusts, yes. The beneficiaries, the objects must be identified with enough clarity. That's certainty of objects.
Okay, but you mentioned the test for this isn't always the same.
Correct, and this is super important for exams. The test you apply depends on the type of trust. Is it a fixed trust, a discretionary trust, or maybe a power of appointment?
Okay, let's break that down. Fixed trusts first. What's the test there?
A fixed trust is where the beneficiaries and their shares are fixed from the start. Like £100,000 on trust for my children, Alice and Bob, in equal shares.
Right, everything's laid out.
For these, the test is the complete list test.
Complete list, meaning?
Meaning the trustee must be able, at least theoretically, to draw up a full list of every single beneficiary. Jenkins L.J. in IRC v. Broadway Cottages Trust said you can't divide equally unless you know everyone in the class.
IRC v. Broadway Cottages Trust.
Okay. But what if you know there are, say, 5 beneficiaries, but you just can't find one of them right now? Does that kill the trust?
Not necessarily. If the number in the class is certain and the shares are fixed, like equal shares, then just having trouble locating one specific person doesn't automatically invalidate the whole thing. Practical difficulty isn't the same as conceptual uncertainty about who's in the class. Okay, that makes sense. Now the big one, discretionary trusts. Trustees get to choose who benefits from a group, right?
Exactly. They have discretion, like £100,000 on trust for my former employees and their relatives, as my trustees shall in their absolute discretion select.
So they don't need a complete list here, surely, because they might only pick a few.
Correct. The test changed for discretionary trusts with the massive case of McPhail v. Dalton. This is a landmark case.
McPhail v. Dalton, what's the test now?
It's called the is or is not test, sometimes called the any given postulant test.
Is or is not.
Is or is not a member of the class. The trustee must be able to look at any person who might potentially claim to be a beneficiary, any given postulant, and say with certainty either, yes, you're in the class, or no, you aren't in the class.
They don't need to list everyone, just be able to say yes or no for anyone who turns up?
Precisely.
So if the class description is really fuzzy, like my friends, that would fail this test too. Because how do you say for sure who is or isn't a friend?
Exactly. That's conceptual uncertainty again, but applied to the objects. If the definition of the class is inherently vague, friends, tall people, maybe even good customers, then you can't operate the is or is not test. The trust would likely fail for conceptual uncertainty.
So conceptual uncertainty kills both fixed and discretionary trusts.
It does, yes. The case that really explored this after McPhail was Rabadin's deed trusts, number 2.
Baden, number 2. Same case, leader hearing.
Exactly. The trust in McPhail was for relatives and dependents. The House of Lords sent it back to the lower court to apply the is or is not test. In Rabadin, number 2, the Court of Appeal judges discuss how to apply it.
And did they agree?
Not entirely. They all agreed the trust was valid for relatives and dependents, finding those terms conceptually certain enough, but they differed slightly on how strict the is or is not test should be, especially regarding evidential uncertainty.
Okay, hang on. Conceptual versus evidential uncertainty. What's the difference there?
Right. Conceptual uncertainty is about the meaning of the words used to define the class. Is the definition itself clear? Friends is conceptually uncertain.
Okay.
And evidential. Evidential uncertainty is when the definition is clear, but it's hard to prove if someone fits it. For example, my cousins. We know what cousin means, conceptually certain, but proving someone is your cousin might be difficult if records are lost. Evidential uncertainty.
Ah, okay. Meaning versus proof. Does evidential uncertainty kill a discretionary trust?
This is where the judges in Rabadin, number 2, differed a bit. Sachs LJ took the view that evidential uncertainty should not defeat a discretionary trust. If the class is conceptually clear, relatives, the burden is just on the claimant to prove they fit the description. If they can't prove it, they're simply treated as being outside the class for practical purposes.
So Sachs LJ was more relaxed about proof issues.
You could say that. Mega LJ suggested a slightly different approach. The test is met if you can say with certainty that a substantial number of people fall within the class, even if there are some borderline cases you're unsure about.
A substantial number.
And then Stamp LJ took the strictest view. He thought you had to be able to say definitively yes or no for every single potential claimant, basically requiring both conceptual and evidential certainty for everyone.
Wow, Stamp's view sounds almost like the old complete list test again.
It's very close, yes. And generally, it's thought Stamp LJ's test was probably too strict and not quite what the House of Lords intended in McPhail. Sachs LJ's approach is often preferred.
So, generally, conceptual uncertainty is fatal, but evidential uncertainty might not be, especially for discretionary trusts.
That's a good summary, yes.
What about getting a third party to decide? Like, my friends, as decided by my executor. Can that fix conceptual uncertainty?
Usually no. Courts are reluctant to let a third party cure conceptual uncertainty. If the definition itself is flawed, someone else's opinion doesn't fix the flaw.
But wasn't there a case about a chief rabbi?
Yes, Re-Ex settlement trusts. That's often distinguished. There, the term was approved wife, and the chief rabbi could decide. But arguably, that was seen more as resolving potential evidential uncertainty within a concept, approved, that might have had a specific meaning within that community, rather than fixing pure conceptual vagueness. It's a subtle distinction. Compare it with Re-Coxon, where a trustee's opinion couldn't save an uncertain condition about residence.
Okay, tricky line there. What about powers of appointment, where someone has the power but not the duty to choose beneficiaries?
For powers of appointment, the test is also the is or is not test. This was established in Regal Benkian's settlement trusts.
Regal-Benkian, same test as discretionary trusts.
Yes, because the holder of the power, the donor, doesn't have to distribute. They just need to be able to tell if any potential recipient is or isn't within the class they can choose from. No need for a complete list.
Got it. And one last category. Gifts subject to a condition, like £1,000 to anyone who was my employee on January 1st.
Yeah, gifts subject to a condition precedent. There's an argument, based on cases like Ree Barlow's will trusts, that these might only need a less strict test,
Ree Barlow's, what's test?
sometimes called the one-person test. The idea is, if the condition is certain enough that you can say at least one person definitely meets it, then that person can receive the gift, even if it's hard to tell if others meet it. Each gift is seen individually, but this is also debated.
Okay, so different tests for different structures. Complete list for fixed is or is not for discretionary and powers, maybe one person for conditional gifts.
That's a framework, yes.
And if a trust fails for uncertainty of objects, what happens to the property? You mentioned resulting trusts earlier.
Exactly. If it was a self-declaration, nothing really happens. The settlor just keeps the property. But if the property was transferred to a trustee and the trust fails for uncertain objects, the trustee holds it on an automatic resulting trust back for the settlor or their estate.
Okay, crucial consequence. So, key cases for objects. Re Endicott, need for beneficiaries. McPhail v. Dalton, introducing is or is not for discretionary. Re Baden, number 2, applying is or is not, conceptual versus evidential. IRC v. Broadway Cottages, complete list for fixed. Regal-Benkians, is or is not for powers. Maybe Re Tux, Re Barlow's.
And don't forget cases on powers like Re Manistee and Re Hayes, which also touch on related issues we should mention briefly.
Right, administrative workability and capriciousness, what are they?
Well, even if your class of objects is conceptually certain under the is or is not test, a trust, particularly a discretionary one, might still fail if it's administratively unworkable.
Unworkable, how? Too many people.
Pretty much. Think of a trust for all the residents of Greater London. We know what resident of Greater London means, conceptually certain, but the class is so huge and constantly changing
That the trustees couldn't possibly survey it properly to exercise their discretion sensibly.
Exactly. It's just not feasible to administer. So such a trust might be void for administrative unworkability, though where you draw the line isn't perfectly clear.
Okay. And capriciousness. Sounds like just being random.
It's related, mainly discussed regarding powers of appointment. A power might be void if it seems utterly capricious, meaning it negatives any sensible intention of the person who created it.
Like a power to benefit Martians.
Or perhaps, as suggested, though doubted later, in Re Manistee settlement trusts, a power for residents of Greater London, given by someone with absolutely no connection to London, might be seen as capricious, pointless.
So it lacks a rational basis?
Something like that. But whether a power can be void just for being capricious, if it's otherwise certain, is still a bit debated. Reha's settlement trusts express some doubt about striking down powers purely for capriciousness.
Okay, so administrative unworkability, size, practicality, capriciousness, lack of sensible intention are extra hurdles, mainly for very large classes or seemingly random powers. Key cases. Re Manistee's, Re Hayes.
Those are the main ones, yes.
All right, we've covered a lot. For our listeners studying hard for exams on this, what are your absolute top tips for mastering the 3 certainties?
Okay, top tips. First, really focus on understanding the why behind each certainty. Why does the law require intention, subject matter, objects to be certain?
Understand the core principles.
Second, memorize the key case names for each certainty and, crucially, the reasoning, the ratio decidendi in those cases. Don't just name drop.
Know the cases and why they matter.
Third, practice applying the tests. Get hypothetical scenarios like problem questions and work through. Is it fixed or discretionary? Which test applies? Complete list. Is or is not. Apply it methodically.
Practice makes perfect.
Fourth, really pay attention to the differences between fixed and discretionary trusts. It affects the object's tests significantly.
Know your trust types.
Fifth, make sure you absolutely grasp the distinction between conceptual uncertainty and evidential uncertainty and know how each impacts validity.
Meaning versus proof again.
And finally, be aware of the debates. Know that Hunter v. Moss is controversial. Understanding these points of debate shows deeper knowledge.
Excellent advice. So to wrap up this deep dive, the 3 certainties, intention, subject matter, objects, are absolutely fundamental for creating a valid express trust in English law.
They ensure the trust is workable, enforceable, and that everyone knows where they stand: the settlor, the trustees, the beneficiaries.
We really encourage you to go back and read these key cases, explore the materials further. Understanding trusts is key to understanding equity.
Absolutely. And maybe a final thought to leave you with as you continue your studies.
Go on.
Think about how the law strikes that balance. It's trying to respect the settler's wishes.
But it also needs practical rules so trust can actually function and be enforced by beneficiary.
Exactly. Why these certainty requirements? What are the underlying policy reasons? Mulling that over can really deepen your understanding of why trust law is the way it is.